Marcus Webb was 47 years old when Pueblo, Colorado recorded its coldest February night in 11 years, 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The city shelter had 94 beds. That night, outreach workers counted 340 men who needed one. The wait list for transitional housing ran 19 weeks. A motel room off the interstate cost $62 a night. 4 nights would have consumed his entire weekly paycheck from day labor in the construction yards. He had been sleeping outside for 22 months behind a hardware store on the south side of the city, while the city's official response was a 10-year housing plan budgeted at $180 million that had produced 23 units in its first 18 months. 23. But 11 months after that February night, Marcus was living inside a steel arch structure with a locking door, an overhead light, and a dry floor. That structure cost $550 to build. What the city did when it found out is the part that changes how you think about this problem. According to HUD's point-in-time count from January 2024, exactly 771,480 people were sleeping either in emergency shelters, transitional housing, or outside with nothing over their heads at all. That was the highest single-year count since federal tracking began. Nearly 153,000 of them were entirely unsheltered. No tent, no car, no floor of a relative's apartment. Just open air and whatever the night brought. The federal government has programs designed to close that gap. Cities have programs. Counties have programs. States have task forces, working groups, and decade-long strategic plans. The programs have been running for years. The count keeps going up. The construction pipeline for traditional emergency shelter has not kept pace. In 2024, the average cost to build 1 unit of permanent supportive housing in a major American city ranged from $300,000 to over $600,000, depending on location. In Los Angeles, that figure exceeded $500,000 per unit. In Denver, a city audit found a shelter expansion program had delivered 41 new beds at total cost of $9.4 million, roughly $229,000 per bed. The average wait list for emergency shelter placement in a mid-sized American city ran 14 weeks in 2024. Not 14 weeks for a home, 14 weeks for a gymnasium floor. You probably drive past men in exactly the situation more often than you realize. And while city planners were still negotiating what Phase 2 of their decade-long strategies might look like, a $550 corrugated steel arch called a mini Quonset had already begun appearing in church parking lots and empty lots from Colorado to the Pacific Northwest, assembled in a single afternoon, occupied the same night. How that structure actually works, and why a city government tried to stop it, is where this story gets complicated. The mini Quonset model being deployed across the Mountain West did not come from a government procurement process or a university engineering lab. It came from a man named Daniel Herman, a 44-year-old Army veteran and former framing contractor in Missoula, Montana, who had been watching his city's shelter wait list grow since 2021 and had run out of patience with it. Herman had worked construction for 19 years. He knew what a Quonset arch was. The Navy had invented it in 1941 because the military needed a structure that could ship flat, assemble fast, and survive field conditions with basic tools. Millions were produced. The design never became obsolete because the problem it solved never became obsolete. A curved corrugated steel arch sheds rain, sheds snow, handles wind loads that would compromise a flat roof frame structure of equivalent size, and does all of that without a single moving part. What Herman changed was scale. A standard Quonset runs 20 feet wide and 40 feet long. Too large for a single occupant, too heavy for a volunteer crew, too expensive even at surplus pricing for most grassroots organizations. He designed the mini version at 8 feet wide and 12 feet long, with a finished interior of 96 square feet. Enough for a sleeping area, a small table, personal storage. The corrugated steel panels bolt together in sequence. End walls framed from standard lumber. A single door and 1 window complete the shell. In the spring of 2022, Herman and 2 friends assembled the first prototype in a Missoula driveway in 4 hours and 20 minutes. He later said he stood inside it afterward and thought, "This is not a tent. This is a locked door and 4 walls and a dry floor that somebody can call their own." What he did not know yet was how hard some people would work to take it away. A design that works in a Missoula driveway still has to survive what the climate throws at it. And the single biggest problem with any corrugated steel structure has always been the same one, a problem that, if you do not solve in the first month, will destroy everything you built within the first year. Steel conducts heat and cold with brutal efficiency. In July in Colorado, the interior of an uninsulated steel arch sitting in direct sun can exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. In January in Montana, the same steel radiates cold inward and creates condensation that drips from every interior surface by morning. Without solving that problem directly, a mini Quonset is not a shelter. It is a metal box that becomes an oven in summer and a refrigerator in winter. The insulation solution used in most current deployments is two-layer rigid foam board, cut to follow the interior curve of the arch and fixed with construction adhesive, then covered with plywood or pallet with paneling for a finished interior surface. Foam board costs approximately $85 to $110 for a full 8 by 12 unit, depending on thickness and regional pricing. Paneling sourced from construction site waste or pallet disassembly adds between $0 and $40, depending on what a volunteer crew can recover for free. The moisture problem requires a separate solution. Warm air from cooking and breathing contacts cold steel and converts to water droplets that drip onto everything below. A 6 mil plastic vapor barrier, stapled to interior framing before the foam panels go up, costs $18 to $22 for a full roll and prevents condensation from reaching the steel. Without it, mold destroys the interior within a single wet season. With it, documented units in the Pacific Northwest have remained dry through 4 consecutive winters. Ventilation comes from the window opening in the end wall, and a 12-inch exhaust vent cut into the upper rear panel and covered with hardware cloth. The arch shape accelerates airflow naturally. Warm air rises toward the crown and exits the rear vent without mechanical assistance. The whole system requires no electricity to function. Total insulation and moisture control cost approximately $115 to $145. Added to the base $550 structure, the fully weatherproof unit lands between $665 and $695. That is less than 12 nights in a budget motel. And what it produces for the man who moves in is something no motel ever could. Marcus Webb had been sleeping outside for 22 months when a volunteer crew from Lift Up, a Pueblo nonprofit, arrived at a West Side church parking lot in November 2024 and began unloading steel panels from the back of a flatbed truck. He had worked construction for 11 years. He recognized the corrugated steel immediately, understood what a bolt sequence meant, knew the arch shape before the first panel went vertical. He watched from the far edge of the parking lot while 4 volunteers assembled the unit. 3 hours and 40 minutes from first panel to closed door. He did not move in that night. He sat outside the unit until nearly midnight. Then he went inside and pulled the door shut behind him. He later said the sound of the latch was the thing he remembered most. Not the warmth, not the LED strip mounted to the ceiling. The latch catching, a door he had closed himself from the inside in a space that was his. Not a shelter bunk 18 inches from the next man, a county housing navigator named David Reyes, who worked with Lift Up's on-site support program, described what a locked door did to the first conversation with a newly housed man. He told a reporter that when someone has his own private space, even 96 square feet of corrugated steel, he is no longer in survival mode. He can think past the night. That single shift, Reyes said, was what made everything else possible. Within 3 weeks, Marcus had connected with a case manager and reactivated a state ID that had lapsed. That ID let him apply for warehouse positions in Pueblo. He was hired in January 2025. A retired contractor named Gene Hoffman, 68 years old, had helped build the unit. He came back the following Saturday with a folding shelf bracket and 3 boards and asked if Marcus wanted shelving on the interior wall. He installed it in 40 minutes. He would not take anything in return. He said he had been in a bad place once himself, about 30 years back, and that somebody had shown up when he had no reason to expect it. He shook Marcus's hand and drove away. Marcus Webb was not the only one. By the end of 2024, The mini Quonset model had reached at least a dozen cities across 7 states, deployed by organizations that had arrived at the same design through entirely separate channels. And the people building them were not who most people would expect. In Spokane, Washington, a veterans organization called Home Base Washington installed 14 units on a gravel lot behind a partnering church in autumn 2024. Each unit was assembled by a volunteer crew, most of them veterans themselves. All 14 were occupied within 9 days of completion. In Billings, Montana, Rimrock Church of the Nazarene organized a build event in March 2025 that drew 23 volunteers, a retired engineer, 2 electricians between jobs, and 8 men from a local recovery program who arrived at 7 in the morning and stayed until the last bolt was set. They assembled 6 units in a single day. A man from a recovery crew named Harold, 51 years old, had been sleeping in a Billings shelter on and off for 3 years. He spent that afternoon building the unit he was about to move into. When someone asked how he felt about it, he picked up a wrench and went back to work. You probably drive past men like Harold in cities like Billings every single day without knowing their name or how long they've been out there. What you would not know, driving past, is that some of them are now building their own way out, one bolt at a time, on a Saturday in a church parking lot. Across every deployment, the same pattern held. The structure itself was almost secondary. What the structure produced, privacy, a locked door, a dry floor that belonged to one person, was what changed what came next. That question of outcomes is where the numbers get deeply uncomfortable for the programs that cost 1,000 times as much. And what those numbers show is something the people running those programs have not been eager to discuss. In 2023, Denver launched a shelter expansion initiative budgeted at $16.2 million. By the end of 2024, according to City Council reporting, that program had produced 71 new emergency shelter beds. Cost per bed, approximately $228,000. Denver's own data showed that 38% of the men placed through that initiative returned to unsheltered status within 6 months. A fully weatherproof mini Quonset unit costs $695. For the price of a single Denver shelter bed, an organization could build 328 of them. The Spokane deployment tracked outcomes for all 14 men who moved into units in autumn 2024. At the 6-month mark, 11 of the 14 had either transitioned to permanent housing or remained stably housed while actively engaged in case management. That is a 78% stable housing rate at 6 months, from a structure that cost $680 and went up in an afternoon. The Denver program cost 335 times as much per unit and produced a worse result. The arithmetic does not need a narrator to explain what it means. In early 2025, the Colorado Department of Local Affairs quietly added modular and prefabricated microshelters as an eligible expense category under its Emergency Housing Assistance Grant Program. The language did not name the mini Quonset model. It described a price point and a footprint that fit almost nothing else at that scale. A government agency had begun pointing toward the thing volunteers had been building in church parking lots for 2 years without asking anyone's permission. That was a signal. But signals from state agencies do not change municipal zoning codes. And in most American cities, placing one of these structures legally remained harder than assembling one, by a margin that would take your breath away if you stopped to look at it directly. Zoning codes in the majority of American cities classify habitable dwellings by minimum square footage, thresholds that a 96-square-foot mini Quonset cannot meet. In Denver, the minimum habitable floor area for a permanent structure is 220 square feet. In Spokane, structures placed on residential lots must connect to municipal water and sewer to qualify as legal residences, a requirement that eliminates every off-grid deployment by definition. In Pueblo, the city zoning office informed Lift Up in early 2025 that the units installed in the church parking lot did not qualify as shelters, did not qualify as accessory structures, and did not qualify as recreational vehicles. The category they fit simply did not exist. Not a safety problem, a paperwork problem. A volunteer crew assembles a fully weatherproofed mini Quonset in an afternoon. The permit process to place it legally on most urban ground runs between 14 and 22 months in Pueblo, Spokane, and Denver alike. Cities that cannot house their own people are simultaneously blocking the structures that can. And the men sleeping outside in those cities are not waiting for a committee to resolve the contradiction. The knowledge of how to build a mini Quonset is moving without permission through every channel the permit process cannot reach, through case manager networks, through men who move out of a unit. Describe what the latch sounded like to a stranger at a food bank, and watch that stranger write something down on the back of a receipt. Through assembly instruction sheets folded into jacket pockets and passed from one build site to the next. Through YouTube tutorials watched at public libraries by men who need to know how an arch goes up and what holds the cold out. The permits are still being argued over in planning offices across 7 states. The structures are already there. Marcus Webb started his warehouse job in Pueblo in January 2025. By April, he had saved enough to move into a room in a shared house on the north side of the city. He left the mini Quonset unit early on a Saturday morning. He took his jacket off the hook on the interior wall. He folded the blanket Gene Hoffman had brought and set it on the sleeping platform for whoever came next. Then he pulled the door shut from the outside and walked to his car. He did not look back. As of mid-2025, roughly 340 mini Quonset units have been deployed across the Mountain West and Pacific Northwest. Assembly instructions were shared freely through a nonprofit repository. Panels could be ordered through regional suppliers in 3 states. The knowledge of how to do it, what it cost, what it required, what it could produce, was moving the way this kind of knowledge has always moved in this country, person to person, parking lot to parking lot. One man describing a latch to another man who had not heard a latch close behind him in 2 years. There are still 750,000 people tonight with nothing over their heads. But in a church parking lot in Pueblo, on a cold November afternoon, 4 volunteers bolted a steel arch together in 3 hours and 40 minutes. They put a latch on the door, and a man who had been sleeping outside for 22 months walked inside and locked it behind him. That is what $550 can do. If stories like this matter to you, subscribing helps more people find this video. And the video on screen right now covers a completely different build. Different city, different structure, same stubbornness. Click it and keep going.